Okay, morning everybody. Thank you very much. Okay, essentially what I'm trying to do is try and draw some ideas from complexity theory to identify and define what are known as complex adaptive systems and their properties, and then try and draw out what they mean for the real world. The interest here, although complex systems apply both in the natural sciences and the physical sciences, physical systems, my interest particularly is in social systems and what it means for organizing, and perhaps some ideas about leadership. Complexity theory, or complexity science as it's sometimes called, is not a single theory as such. Rather, it's an ensemble of ideas, concepts, frameworks, metaphors that focuses on the structure and behavior of complex systems. It is transdisciplinary both in its genesis as well as in its application, and its focus is, somewhat unsurprisingly, on nonlinear dynamical systems. Now, all that technical jargon we will try to avoid as much as we can, but if you just allow me one more slide with a bit of some jargon. This is how, by drawing on complexity theory, we may be able to define a complex adaptive system. And essentially, it's a system comprised of heterogeneous agents that interact locally. A fairly long definition, but if we get to its essence, it's talking about bottom-up interactions between agents. Now, what are agents? Well, agents in physical systems could be molecules. They could be neurons in the brain. In human systems, they could be human actors in an organization. They could be firms in an industry. So we have a full plethora of what agents could be. What's important is that they're heterogeneous, meaning that they all don't have to be the same. They have different risk propensities, qualifications, experiences, goals, belief, etc. In complex adaptive systems, if we look at this definition, another thing to pay attention to is that agents have schema. Schema is basically some way of encoding the environment. When it comes to us, human actors, then schema may be equated to what we call mental models. So where this all leads to is complex adaptive systems are essentially bottom-up interactions between agents, human actors, if we're talking about social systems, that lead to the macro states of the outcomes and the outcomes of our organizing as well, if we're looking at human systems. Some examples of complex adaptive systems, well, we've got physiological systems, we've got cities, regions, countries, firms, economies, industries. These are all complex adaptive systems. The open source movement is a very good example of complex adaptive systems, and I see later in the day, I think it's Craig and Rosemary going to be talking of this kind of stuff. That's quite intriguing because here you have, in some of these virtual worlds, you have avatars which are agents, and then you have the human actors who are agents as well, and then that gets even much more complex. In fact, in a sense, the TED community is a complex adaptive system. It's through bottom-up interactions that we have the outcomes of what we see from TED. Okay, if I can just get this thing to drive a little bit, can somebody help me? Oh, there we go. Okay, so from drawing on complexity theory, we may be able to identify some of the properties of complex adaptive systems. And what I have here in the middle are a whole host of properties that one could say are scientifically established as properties of complex adaptive systems by looking at the research and the literature. We don't have to go into all of the details. They sound all very heavy, but we can look at one or two and just explore what they mean, because the interest here is what are the implications for us as human beings in the way we interact with each other. So if I just maybe focus on one or two of them, let's start off with sensitive dependence. Sensitive dependence on initial conditions essentially says that imperceptible differences in starting conditions can lead to hugely divergent outcomes. So let's take one or two examples. Two raindrops, top of a mountain, small gust of wind, one on this side of the mountain, the other on the other side of the mountain, land up in two different oceans. If you take some baking dough, put blue dot and a red dot right next to each other, and then you go through the kneading and folding. That's the mathematical operation. Eventually, the two dots are wide apart. So if we had this TED event tomorrow, as opposed to today, it's likely that there would be hugely divergent outcomes to what we had today. Okay, sensitive dependence on initial conditions. A corollary to that, in a sense, is path dependence, which essentially says that history matters. So what it says is that even if we have two systems that look very similar, the likelihood of the outcomes will be very, very different, because history matters, where we come from matters, even though what we look like right now might look very similar. Complex adaptive systems co-evolve with each other, meaning that one impacts the other. There's two levels of coevolution. There's coevolution at the macro level. The agents co-evolve with each other. And the system as a whole co-evolves with other systems. So for example, in an economy, firms co-evolve with other firms, etc. One of the interesting ones that I'd like to just spend a little bit of time on is this property of far from equilibrium. Complex adaptive systems are far from equilibrium systems. Now, most of our understanding and our conventional wisdom treats systems as homeostatic, the cybernetic principle of equilibrium seeking, whereas in fact, complex adaptive systems are far from equilibrium systems, and that has certain implications for what we think in terms of real-world implications. Perhaps if I can just bear with me a little bit, I'll talk on one or two more of them before we move on. Complex adaptive systems have the property of emergence. These systems have emergent properties, meaning that the properties of the system arise as a result of the relationship between the parts. Those properties do not reside in the parts themselves, but is as a result of the interrelationships. Simple example is water, 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen. Neither of them have the property of wetness. It's the relationship between them that gives us the property of wetness. In other examples, traffic is an emergent property of a system. Culture is an emergent property of the interrelationships. So what that points to is sometimes we think we can design outcomes that we want, but we've got to be careful because these are emergent properties which may not be fully in our control. Complex systems have the ability to self-organize, and what that says is that they can sometimes spontaneously self-organize to new levels of order, and the order is not imposed from outside. The order emerges from the system itself through the processes of bottom-up interactions. They have a history, and in a sense, history is a kind of memory. So complex adaptive systems have a memory that's embedded within them. But what's important is the memory does not reside in any single agent or small group of agents. It is distributed throughout the system. And that also has some implications because it means that we cannot fully, no one of us can fully understand the system because it's embedded, the history is embedded throughout the system. And that talks to another property just now, after the last property on the list. In complex systems, we can think of this idea of artifacts as kind of agents. Now, what do I mean there? Well, artifacts are anything that we as human beings create. So they can be physical, tangible things, but they can also be ideational creations. So for example, our machinery, our cars, our production lines are all artifacts, but so are our blueprints, our designs, our maps. All of these things are artifacts that we create. Now, if we take this perspective of complex adaptive systems, we can think of artifacts also as kinds of agents because we co-evolve with the artifacts that we create. And what that means is that our artifacts constrain and liberate our actions. A nice example or a way of thinking about it, apparently there's a saying that's attributed to Churchill that says something along the lines of, we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. So that shows us how artifacts can constrain and liberate our actions. And finally, the last property that I want to just talk about a little bit is the property of egalitarianism. Now, we know that from our definition of complex adaptive systems, agents have heterogeneity, meaning they have full diversity. So we're not putting any limitations on agents in terms of their diversity and their heterogeneity. However, in one sense, all agents are the same. They're equal in one respect. And in this respect only, I mean, they're equal, and they have this kind of equality, is that no single agent can stand outside the system, understand the system, and understand the environment in its full complexity. That, in my view, has very, very profound implications for when it comes to organizing and when it comes to leadership. And a simple way of saying this is, if no agent can stand outside the system and understand the environment, it means what? No CEO, no managing director, no general of an army, no president of a country can stand outside the system, fully understand the system, design a way forward. So it has implications for our understanding of what we think and mean about leadership. Okay, so there's all this technical stuff, but I hope I've been able to kind of draw out some of what they mean, and now I want to draw out some lessons if we take all of the properties as a whole. I've alluded to them a little bit in talking on some of the properties, but I'd like to now maybe just spend a little bit of time in terms of drawing out some of the implications for what does all of this mean when it comes to real-world systems. I hope you'll agree with me that if we look at our definition of complex adaptive systems and look at the properties, you will accept that complex social systems are complex adaptive systems. And therefore, organizations are complex adaptive systems. So let's look at what it might mean and draw out some lessons, perhaps. Well, the first one is that the interpretations of the actors, the interpretations of the agents, determine what the system is. You're dealing with human actors, and if you have this bottom-up interactions and this changing schemata, that means the system is partially designed by how we interpret it and the human actors in it interpret it. It also means that there's a strong relationship between our theoretical frameworks, our concepts of the world, and reality, because we construct that reality through that. So, sir, the quantum understanding of the world, if it spreads, it'll change our perception of the world, it'll change our schemata, it'll change how we behave with each other. So there's a strong linkage between our theoretical frameworks, our understanding, our concepts, and how we actually construct the world. So therefore, this idea of complexity theory is also, in a sense, a worldview of how we come to understand the world. And if we come to understand the world differently, we will behave differently. And we have to understand that what it means is that real-world systems are not a set of fixed relations between tangible components. Rather, it's an ever-changing system that is an integrated whole that is made up of biophysical, material, ideational, informational, and social components that are intertwined and penetrate each other. And it is partially socially constructed. Now, what does this all mean? Well, it means that when we come to work and try to understand some of the intractable problems facing us as humanity, we can't take this disciplinary, single-focused disciplinary perspective. The real world does not present to us economic problems. It does not present to us social problems. It does not present to us problems for physicists. The real world are phenomena, and we construct these categories to deal with them. What it's calling for is a kind of transdisciplinary way of understanding our reality. Okay, if we now move on and try and just think about, well, what does it mean for organizations, because that's part of the interest here for me, is what does it mean for the way we come to organize and how we lead our organizations, is that organizations are complex and dynamic, and hence a technocratic approach is not helpful. Recipes don't work, and we've got to be careful and cautious about the 10-step plan to achieve X, and the 5-stage so-and-so's model, and et cetera, et cetera. There is no objective, rational way to optimize the system as a whole. We have to take the specific local conditions and context into account. And here, if we go back to the theme of Africa Change the World, it means that here, when we draw, and we must draw on the collective knowledge of humanity wherever it may reside in the world. But we can't uncritically take these models and apply them where we are. The local context is important. The idea that knowledge is universal and the same everywhere does not apply in complex systems when you are dealing with human activity systems. Knowledge is contingent and on the local conditions and the local context. It also means that we have to be a bit more tentative and provisional about our sense of knowing and what we can know. And that includes everything I've been saying, because I'm kind of presenting it as if it's certainty. We have to let go, we have to be provisional, we have to be more tentative about our understanding and about what we can know in complex systems. There's this idea of, as human beings, as human actors, if we look at some of these properties, there's a sense of we have to be able to let go of control a little bit. And that's quite frightening, because if we let go of control, then where's there going to be order? Well, order emerges from the system itself. Order doesn't necessarily have to come from the top. Doesn't necessarily have to come from expertise. Doesn't necessarily have to come from the leaders. Okay, so then I'd like to, it might raise a debate of, well, this guy is talking all this stuff. Does that mean we just become fatalistic because, complex systems, things will emerge, self-organize? What does it mean for human agency and volition? Well, by definition, agents have agency. And we have volition, we have will, we have the power to act, and we must be responsible for those actions. So none of what I'm saying is suggesting that we become fatalistic and let just things happen. What I'm suggesting, though, is that while we have agency for our local actions and our local interactions, its local actions lead to global outcomes, but we have no control on the macro states of the system. We have agency in our local interactions, but we have no agency on the outcomes that will emerge through processes of emergence and self-organization. Okay, so now let's talk just a little bit about leadership. Well, this is no great, discovery. Leadership is complex. But I think we must start shifting our notion of leadership. Leadership doesn't reside in a person or in a position, but rather, if we take this complex adaptive systems view of the world, leadership becomes a systemic meta-capability. And what it means is we can't get what we want by leadership edict or decree. And I think that's, over the last 10, 15, 20 years, the theory of leadership has come to accept that, this idea of the guy at the top who says this must happen, and edict, and everything will happen. I think the theory of leadership theory has come to accept that. However, we must also be cautious about what's today's standard leadership prescriptions. For example, things like transformational leadership and visionary leadership and inspirational leadership that through processes of charisma, and we fire up the ranks and everybody will follow us, and we have a shared vision and we all rally around that vision. We must be a little bit cautious about that because, again, this idea of not having agency on the macro states of the system, we've got to be. In my view, some of these prescriptions are nothing but ideological brainwashing, and we perpetuate it through our organizational propaganda in the form of newsletters and our emails and those kinds of things. So, if we can just reflect a little bit, we know that the president recently appointed a National Planning Commission. And I think the lessons from this kind of thinking is that we've got to be cautious about our expectations from such a National Planning Commission. Because we know that no agent, no single agent, no small group of agents can understand the full complexity of the system and the environment and design interventions for us to move forward. Therefore, no planning commission can do it for us either. It's not to say we don't draw on their expertise and we draw on their knowledge and so on, but we have to temper our expectations of what such a National Planning Commission can do for us. And our major societal problems won't just go away through some sweeping leadership action or decree. Okay, and then maybe just one or two thoughts on strategy, because this is all in this area of organizing, leadership, strategy. Strategic planning, when we engage in strategic planning, either in the form of strategic retreats, bosbarads, indabas, lahotlas, politely, are nothing but merely ritual and rain dance. They do absolutely nothing for us. I mean, all of these properties will tell us that. So, yeah, because we're unable to understand the full dynamics of our complex systems that we're dealing with, our organizations, because of this notion of bounded rationality. And the same applies, with all due respect, to performance management systems. Because performance management systems assume a single line of sight between actions and outcomes. It doesn't take the full feedback effects of all of the interactions, et cetera, et cetera. So again, we've got to be a little bit cautious about what performance management systems can do for us. At best, they're a waste of time and they destroy value. At worst, they're actually very destructive. They can lead to toxic outcomes, and they're pathological, as we saw in the financial crisis, subprime, all of those kinds of things. So because strategy is always an emergent prospect. By the way, I heard on the news last night that the president has set performance targets for his cabinet ministers. Again, there's nothing wrong with having aspirations about our performance targets, but if it's seen as a kind of this notion of corporate performance management systems that we're now applying to government, exactly the same would apply. And again, we must be as citizenry. As citizenry, we have agency, and we must think about what these things mean for us. And finally, I think, basically, I tried to share with you, drawing from complexity theory, understanding what complex adaptive systems are, and we can draw out some implications for how we manage social systems, quite difficult. Optimization techniques don't work. We can't rely on long-term planning and prediction. There are no omniscient leaders or wise men or women. There's emergent order as opposed to imposed order. We have to take into account the importance of context, need to make local improvements, adopt a learning mindset, and maybe some ideas around strategic improvisation. And finally, I think where it all boils down to is we need to have a bit more humility in what we can understand and what we can do, what we can know, our sense of knowing, and acknowledge our human foibles and frailties as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks.